Okay. Good evening from the Foreign Correspondent Club. My name is Phil Robertson. I'm an FCCT board member and the chairperson of the program committee. And I want to welcome you all here today to talk about what's going on with the US election and what sort of impacts it's going to have here in Thailand and Southeast Asia. However, before I get into that, I wanted to make a few announcements about upcoming events at the club. Tomorrow evening, there is going to be a very special evening with an evening with Thai gold medalist Panipak Wong Patanakit. You may know her nickname is Tennis, even though she doesn't play tennis. She's a Taekwondo champion. She's Thailand's only two-time gold medal champion. She just recently defended her Taekwondo championship at the Olympics in Paris, and she will be here tomorrow at 7. So please do come, ask questions about her experience and her career, what motivates her, how she was able to go as far as she had and become, Thailand's only two-time gold medalist. So that will be tomorrow at 7. We have a board games night next Tuesday on the 15th. That happens every Tuesday night. We have board games. On the 18th of October, we have our trivia night for the month, the FCCT Pub Trivia. Please come and join with friends, form a team, and compete for prizes. On the 23rd of October, next Wednesday, we're going to have a program on Myanmar's fragile media, a catastrophe of freedom, safety, and survival. This is being organized by Burma News International, talking about the changing situation for journalism in Myanmar. This is obviously a major concern for the club. We have been doing a lot of work to try to support Burmese journalists in exile, and you're encouraged to come and hear from a very senior panel of Burmese journalists about the challenges that they're facing. And then on the 1st of November, we have a performance, Shakespeare for Dummies, The Final Frontier. And this is a hilarious performance of Shakespeare's greatest hits with guest appearances from Marlon Brando, Laurence Olivier, Richard Burton, Bob Dylan, Anthony Hopkins, Muddy Waters, Rappers and Rogues, Vagabonds, Scoundrels, Charlatans, and Hoodwinkers, all coming to the FCCT on the 1st of November at 7 p.m. So a lot on the schedule for this coming month. If you're a member of the FCCT, you get into all programs for free, and you get 20% off of your food and drink bill. So obviously, we encourage you to join the FCCT. So in just over 3 weeks, Americans are going to be going to the polls. In fact, many Americans are already going to the polls, voting from overseas, voting in advance in various different states where that's possible. It's a very stark comparison between these two candidates. And the big question that we're being asked out here is, what is the U.S. election going to mean for U.S. policy, for U.S. foreign policy, for instance, relations with Thailand, but also in the larger region, not only Southeast Asia, but relations with China, East Asia, and others, and all the various different issues in between, ranging from human rights, refugees, environmental issues, what have you. It's a very tumultuous process right now. Every indication is the polls are very close, and it's quite clear that depending on who wins, you're going to see a very radically different perspective or approach to some of the issues that will affect the lives of people out in Southeast Asia. So we have today two panelists who have joined me here, and I'm also going to speak. I should note at the outset that we did invite a representative from Republicans Overseas, the Thai chapter. Unfortunately, they were unable to come. The chairperson was traveling, and he was unable to line up a replacement to come and speak. So unfortunately, we don't have the representative Republican Overseas, but we did try to find one, and we did try to get him to come. So So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Keith Richburg. Keith Richburg's the former Southeast Asia correspondent of the Washington Post. Now he's a columnist and an editorial writer for the Washington Post, in addition to the many other things that he handles. So I'm going to turn it over to Keith to share some thoughts with us. What we're going to do is we're going to have each of us talk 10, 15 minutes at the most, and then we'll turn to question and answers. So save your questions for the end, and we'll be looking forward to answer those.
Thank you very much, Phil. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much. I should say at the outset, I'm not representing the Republican side here. But since I work for the Washington Post and we're supposed to be independent, then I will at least try to be balanced and independent in my talk here. And by the way, I didn't prepare anything too formal here, so it's more of my observations and a chat. And also just in advance warning, I've got to leave around 8:30, 8:40 sharp because I'm going to the airport for a midnight flight. I'm going off on vacation to Europe. Mainly that's for vacation, but it's also because I've been spending too much time binge watching CNN trying to figure out what's going on in the election, so I just need to get away from it for a couple weeks and come back on November 4th or 5th when the voting starts. And you mentioned upcoming events. I don't know if there's going to be an election watching event here at the club or not.
Not clear yet.
The Democrats have one.
Not clear yet. Okay, yeah, all right.
You can hear from Jamie in a little bit about that.
So I may or may not be here at the club. If you want to see, you can always email me. I'm at KeithRichberg@gmail.com, or otherwise I'll see you here at the club on election day. Well, it's Wednesday here when we get the results coming in. I'll be here with a bottle of champagne and a bottle of whiskey, and I'll open either one depending on which way the result goes. So just a couple of quick observations from me, kind of in no particular order, but just a little bit of background. I covered the first election I actually covered as a journalist. I was still in university, getting ready to graduate, was the 1980 election, Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan. I actually started covering that in 1979. When the campaign started as a university student. I was doing political science. I almost had enough credits to graduate a bit early, but Buddy and I decided it'd be fun to cover the primaries, et cetera, so we had a very nice political science professor who loaned us a couple of $100 out of his pocket for gas money. I'm from Michigan, by the way, so we drove around to cover the Iowa caucuses. We covered the Illinois primary, New York primary, New Hampshire primary, just basically driving around in my old beat-up Ford. And so that was my first experience. And then I got to go to the Republican convention in Detroit that year because I'm a native Detroiter. And so that was kind of my experience covering politics. And I've covered a few other campaigns intermittently when I was not a foreign correspondent. Most recently, the 2008 campaign, where I rode around on Obama's plane for a little bit, and also covered Hillary Clinton's campaign a bit, and John McCain a bit, because I was based in New York as the New York bureau chief for the Washington Post. And Hillary was from New York. Obama was making a play for a lot of votes out of New York. And John McCain was expected to do well in some congressional districts of New Jersey. So I got to go down there and cover a little bit of that in the 1980 campaign before coming back overseas again. All my years at least watching politics and then covering 1980 up to now, this is pretty much, I think, the closest I've seen an election coming in this late in the game. A lot of elections have been close, but usually when you get to about mid-October, in the previous ones, I could tell you kind of which way it was looking. I think the 1980 one, it was basically the last week or so of October before it started breaking for Ronald Reagan. It actually looked really tight up until then. So what makes this one unique is how close it's been, and how unchanging the polls have really been. She's up a little bit in some swing states, he's up a little bit in some swing states, but it's been basically the same for the last few weeks or so. The other thing that's a bit unique in this one, I believe this is the first election I will recall, and somebody will correct me, I know if I'm wrong on the history, where there will not be a debate in October. And so we won't have a presidential debate in October. We might have an October surprise, but it won't be a debate. There won't be the chance for someone to come out and break out because of a good debate performance in October, or a terrible debate performance as Gerald Ford had when he was running against Jimmy Carter the first time and said Poland was not dominated by the Soviet Union or something like that. So this one's, on terms of the issues, again, I mean, you guys have seen the same polls that I have. On the top issues that people say they care about, which are the economy and immigration, Trump has the edge on those, and he's doing better than Kamala Harris. She does better on issues like abortion. She does health care. And on the generic question of which candidate does better, will do better for people like me. She does a lot better on that score as well. She actually has relatively high positive ratings, and Trump has relatively high negative ratings. And one thing I find interesting is the way people looking back are now saying that things were better under the Trump presidency than they are now. And you could argue why that's so. We could discuss that in the Q&A section. But people seem to think that things are, and again, I'm not talking about the actual numbers. Crime is actually down, according to FBI statistics. Number of people crossing at the border illegally are actually down from about 3 years ago, according to all the statistics. Inflation is actually down from the highs of the first part, 2001, 2002, when it was really high. It's come down to 2.5%, something like that now. But again, people aren't feeling that yet. Maybe that hasn't trickled through. So people are still worried about the price of eggs, the price of cornflakes, et cetera. The other thing that's kind of fascinating about this is that opinions seem to be kind of baked in at this point. So people wonder why when former President Trump says something completely outrageous or something crazy, or Bob Woodward reports that he gave COVID tests to Vladimir Putin when we couldn't get COVID tests, and nothing seems to dent him. I think everybody has already got an opinion about Donald Trump. I think a lot of people still don't have an opinion about Kamala Harris yet. So maybe that's why Trump's numbers don't seem to be hurt by anything. I'm not a strategist, so maybe the strategists can talk here. But a lot of people say it's no good just running ads to reminding people of how terrible Donald Trump is, or reminding them of January 6th, or reminding them of all the parade of horribles that happened during his administration, because everybody already knows that. That's already baked in. And one of the things that's really, and again, I'm not in the prediction business as a journalist, because every election always surprises me somehow. But one of the things that I've actually found kind of interesting, going back, and again, without making predictions on this per se, is that if you look at his numbers in 2016, when he surprisingly lost to Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College, she actually won the popular vote. She got 48.2% of the national vote, and he got 46.1%. In 2020, Biden got 51.3%, so over 50%, and Trump got 46.8%. So 46.1%, and then he got 46.8% 4 years later. So, roughly within 1 point. If you look at where he's at now in the polls, almost every poll shows him around 46, 47, maybe maximum 48%. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think he's got a ceiling there. And I don't think he's getting more than 48% in any poll that I've seen. I've seen polls where they're tied at 48-48. I've seen some where she's up 2 points, 50-48. I've seen some where she's down 1. But I've never seen him, or very rarely, maybe an outlier poll or so. So I've never seen him over that kind of 48% margin. So it just leads me as a journalist to look at that and say, maybe that means he's got a bit of a ceiling there. And so one of the couple of key things are going to come out of it. And by the way, that's talking about the national popular vote, not the swing states. So one of the things that leads me to believe is that he's got a bit of a ceiling in terms of the popular vote, about 40, something between what he got before, 46, 47, maybe 48% at the high side in the popular vote. And with the departure from the race of RFK Jr., and it doesn't look like Jill Stein and Cornel West or anybody else is getting any traction, I don't know if she can consolidate the non-Trump vote and do what Biden did, which is get over 50%. Excuse me. The other thing to look out for, which I think is really fascinating, is turnout. And a lot of people say that, I think as journalists or in the media, we often overstate what these things do, what these elections do. We say Americans voted this way, or Americans believe this because they voted for Trump, or Americans believe that because they've turned the page on Trump. We have to remember that the highest point of a turnout we've ever had was 66.6% of eligible voters in the 2020 election. That's the high, and that was of eligible voters, not all American adults. So only 66.6, say 67% to make it easy. Only 67% of eligible voters actually voted. So to somehow turn that into a mandate saying all Americans think this or all Americans think that is not correct. And so this election is really, to me, going to come down to who can get their people out to the polls, who can get their people out. And if the Trump campaign, which doesn't have as much of a ground game, but have outsourced that to these outside groups, if they can get their people out to the polls, that's one thing. If the Democratic side, which has invested a lot in this, can get their people out to the polls, then I think that's going to say a lot as well. But again, everything always comes down, as always, it always comes down to turnout, and turnout again. Again, and one of the things I'll say before I turn it over here, I was going to talk a little bit about the pivot to Asia, but I saw you were going to talk about Asia and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in Asia, so I won't dwell on that unless something comes up in the Q&A. But let me talk about the swing states a little bit, because the elections really, we know at this point the election's really only taking place in about 6 or 7 states. I would take it down to even 6, because I think some of them are not as competitive as people think they are. It would not be a surprise to me to see this election decided by a couple 100,000 votes in all of those swing states. Although, as I said, I'm always one for elections always surprise me in some way. It would not surprise me to see if one of the two of them sweeps all of them. And if one of the two of them sweeps all of the swing states, it could end up being an electoral college landslide. By sweeping them, I mean winning them all. They might win them all by a small percentage, but in our electoral college system, if you win Pennsylvania by 80,000 votes, you get all of the electoral college votes. And I think what I'll be looking for, if you guys do something at the FCC, I'll be watching at home in the beginning. I will know by about noon or 1 p.m. on the Wednesday after the election which way it looks, because I'm going to be looking at Florida. I'm going to be looking at those that count their votes early enough. And I'm not talking about all the mail-in votes and all that, but if Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, some of the ones that can count early enough. Again, it doesn't matter what the final result is. We may not know that for weeks. But if Kamala Harris is looking strong in Florida, she's not going to win Florida, I don't think. She might. But if she's looking stronger than anybody thought in Florida, then I think it's going to be a good night for her. Why would she be looking? And Florida actually counts their votes relatively early, believe it or not. Why would she be looking stronger in Florida? There's an abortion referendum on the ballot that might turn out a whole lot of people who are not traditional voters as well. Some of these other states can start counting the early votes, because as Phil mentioned, people are voting now. Some of those states can start counting those early votes either before Election Day or on the morning of Election Day, so we should have a pretty good look at what some of these states look like early on. Again, I'm not saying it won't be contested, it won't take weeks, but we'll have a pretty good idea. Virginia is another one. I actually I thought Hillary Clinton was going to have a bad night because she was losing Virginia in the first early returns. She ended up winning Virginia, barely. But it should not have been that close. And so I remember looking at that going, if she's doing this badly in Virginia, it's going to be a bad night for her nationwide. So no, you don't have to wait till all the votes are counted out west. You're going to have a pretty good idea by, I think, about noon or 1 p.m. Which way it's going. And as I said, I wouldn't be surprised if all the swing states swing one way. It may not happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if, out of those 6 or 7 swing states, if 5 of them don't go for one candidate or the other candidate. And I think, so get your bottle of champagne on one side, get your bottle of whiskey on the other side, and decide which is, don't open either one of them until about noon. I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you very much, Keith. We actually, I think when we had the ballot, we had an event here in 2017 after Trump was inaugurated, and a group of people whose names shall remain anonymous managed to drink all the tequila in the club. Yeah, so no, it was ugly. In any case, I'm going to now turn it over to Jamie Brennan. Jamie is the chairperson of the Democrats Abroad in Thailand. The Democrats Abroad is part of the overseas arm of the Democrat Party of the United States. And so, Jamie, all yours.
Thanks. Ooh. Just move that a little bit away from me so I'm not screaming at all of you. So hi, yes, my name is Jamie Brennan, and I'm going to talk to you tonight very on topic, on brand. I'm fairly corporate in my real life, so please forgive the PowerPoint. It's how I think. So we're going to talk tonight about Kamala Harris and why she's a really good partner for Thailand and for Asia in general. But one of the things that I do want to talk about a little bit before I talk about our great candidate and hopefully incoming president is a little bit about my journey on how I ended up in this chair. So we talked about swing states and we talked a lot about the red states and how they're going to have an impact for Trump. But what we're seeing is something very interesting. A lot of us, more than you would think, in the red states are switching over to the Democratic Party. And I say that as someone who was born and raised in Montgomery, Alabama. It's not just me, and it's not just parts of my family, but it's people that I grew up with that for the first time ever are considering to vote Democrat. And on the Alabama ballot, because I got to vote early, there were actually 12 seats, I believe, up for judges, and over half of them were Democrats uncontested. So we're actually starting to see a shift, and we had 2 Democratic senators on the ballot for the state Senate, which I have never seen in all of my voting years, which has been a few. So I'm really proud to be here tonight to represent Democrats Abroad, the organization that even registered me to vote in Thailand when I first moved here 8 years ago, and they helped me register Republican. And I sit here very proudly today as the chair of Democrats Abroad, having completely flipped to the other side. All right, so I don't have control over my slides, so every time you guys hear the word ding, it's just me asking to have my slides. Thank you so much. See, perfect. So the first thing I want to talk about is Our Lady Kamala. What has she done in the past that indicates we will have a successful future? So when we're talking about Thailand, I was actually at APEC with Michael over here, and it was a really exciting time to see Kamala come in and actually participate in APEC. She visited Thailand and she met with the Prime Minister at the time, which I will say Donald Trump was the first person in 12 years to have met with the Prime Minister of Thailand. However, he also cut $813 billion in trade tariffs for Thailand that year, significantly impacting their trade. Whereas Kamala Harris actually came to APEC and continued the conversation on through when the U.S. was hosting the APEC summit in 2023. She was helping to strengthen the bilateral bonds as well as focusing on other parts of trade development that would benefit Thailand. Ding! So let's also talk about enhanced security cooperation. Who here is scared of cybercrime? Yeah, and I say this as a literal AI specialist for my job. I'm very nervous about it. And so one of the things that I think is exceptional is that Kamala Harris, as vice president, has worked with Thailand to strengthen the support of fighting cybercrime, whether that's in Thailand, the United States, or internationally. She is specifically focused on this issue because cybercrime is trans-border. And I think that speaks very solidly to her diplomatic relations capabilities as well as to her knowledge on current issues that are impacting all of us. She's also done a series of strengthening of other security measures, talking about joint military operations. As we all know, JustMag is here, which is the educational arm of the U.S. military here in Thailand. And then she's promoted regional stability. I think we can say casually that she has supported a de-strengthening of China's arm in some very important cases around Taiwan, and we're happy to see that and how it can potentially support Thailand as well. Ding! So economic cooperative initiatives. So I happen to be a little bit of an economist, mostly because my jobs have all involved trade. So one of the things that I really want to bring to the table is Kamala Harris has done something with President Biden over the past few years that you may or may not know about. It's called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. This is not a trade negotiation as we think of it as bilateral or multilateral. What it is a series of new agreements that will help facilitate trade, technology, and job creation around the world. There's also been 14 American multinational organizations that the Biden administration, with the help of Kamala Harris, signed on to this. And you have already started to see the economic impact of this in Thailand. I personally was one of the people that helped with the roundtables for the supply chain resilience. This was brought about as a response to supporting COVID supply chains, ensuring that not only can we get the goods and products that we need from more than one country, but are we actually effectively implementing the supply chain for all products should a pandemic hit again. There's also the investment promotion. So she's focused on clean energy, electric vehicles, electronics, and the digital industry. These are all the priorities in Thailand that were brought up during APEC and were continued on into the United States. And then last but certainly not least, Thailand is a medical hub. I think we all know that. And Kamala Harris has come out in strong support of helping people to seek medical care globally. Ding. So climate action support. I know, it's cute, right? So one of the things that I think is really great when you have countries trade off, so you have APEC being hosted in Thailand and then it being hosted the next year in the United States. a lot of times initiatives will get started at these intergovernmental meetings that don't get followed up on, and that's a real shame. A country spends an entire year focusing on how can we make our country and the world a better place, and then it goes to the next country and they're like, ha ha ha, no dice. We're not going to do that because we didn't come up with it. However, the Biden-Harris administration has shown that they are interested in continuing the good work no matter where the good work comes from. And Kamala has come out in support of the biocircular green economy. I'm sure many of you have heard of the BCGs. Here in Thailand, yeah? We're going to promote electric vehicles, we're going to promote green jobs, we're going to do biofuels, we're going to recycle stuff, and that's all kinds of, we're going to try to reduce clean air, or try to increase clean air. And the Biden-Harris administration has also made a significant investment in Thailand specifically to promote clean air initiatives in Chiang Mai, Chiang Rai, and Bangkok. And they've done $500,000 for regional airshed projects just in Asia alone. And then there's the Clean Energy Fund, which is supporting finding new ways to do clean energy in places where it hasn't been before. And last but not least, we certainly love the zero emission transition because it's pithy. And it's also something that's happening in the US and here in Thailand. So we like to see that bilateral support. Ding. And then there's, of course, the Mekong regional commitment. And so one of the things that I do really love is that we haven't had a lot of presidential or vice presidential visits here in Thailand, but Kamala Harris has made the time. And look at the fact that this administration has requested $20 million for Japan, US, Mekong region investments. This is specifically to promote green power, reaffirming the US commitment to the Mekong region's clean initiatives, and then ACMEX. I think that's how we're going to go with it, ACMEX. Support, I would love to pretend like I can say that. That's why it's on the screen. I can't pronounce that correctly. So please bear with me. But the importance of this strategy is looking how to bring more people inclusively into the economy. And that doesn't just mean getting more Thai products into the United States. It means getting more US products here in Thailand as well to help support. There's actually a very interesting initiative that the US State Department has done alongside of this under the Biden-Harris administration to promote women entrepreneurs in Thailand and the United States, actually having a joint program where they mentor each other on different parts of business that the other side may know and how to enter into each other's markets. It's this type of cooperation and international collaboration that focuses on key flashpoints, and I say this as a female entrepreneur myself, that really help us to increase our soft power as the United States, and also to increase our own knowledge, because it would be hubris to believe that as Americans we wouldn't have something to learn from an incredible powerhouse like Thailand in the business world. Ding. Okay, human rights. We love the human rights because we're all human. So we think. So some really important things that we want to focus on. We've seen under the Trump administration and under the tactics that have been administered for the Trump campaign, which I won't talk a lot about, we've seen a devaluing of human rights. And when I say human rights, I do really mean about our ability to advocate for ourselves, the ability to own the choices that happen to us, to our bodies, to our children. We've seen an attack on that. There have been 591 laws passed that are anti-trans across the United States, specifically by Republican-held majority areas. And as the mother of a non-binary trans child, that's terrifying to me. To take away the decision that my child, my doctor, and I want to make, that's something that a government shouldn't do. Family decisions should stay with families. And Kamala Harris pushes for that, not just in the United States, but also here in Southeast Asia. And then there's, of course, the funding for promotion of government and freedom of information. And then last but not least, a balanced approach. So one of the things that we really like about Kamala Harris is that when she approaches a topic, it doesn't come out as incredibly on one side or the other. It tries to take a culturally balanced approach to what is going to work for the United States as well as for the country that she is working with, in this case, Thailand. Ding. Don't worry, we're moving right through it, guys. There's not too many more slides. Of course, there's the strategic partnerships. One of the things that Kamala does very well is we see her actually trying to bring people together around key topics. We see a continuation of the Biden administration's engagement approach as she's moving into a presidential candidacy. She's not saying I'm going to leave everything behind, but instead the things that are important, like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity that was an incredible coup, can continue on and help build prosperity, not just for the United States, but for the entire region of Asia Pacific. Then there's the balance. Looking at how do we help other countries ensure that they can manage the balance of China in this region. So we do consider this one addressing human rights. That's very important. But there's also been the Inflation Reduction Act. So under the Biden administration, it would be continued under a Harris administration. The Inflation Reduction Act looks to help smaller businesses and smaller countries actually compete in the U.S. market by changing the tariff and import structure. Additionally, it says that by 3 years out of a sunset rule, I know this is pretty technical, that all parts for solar power are not to be permitted from China inside of the United States, which is a huge opportunity for other countries in Southeast Asia because there's already the manufacturing here, the access to the mineral and rare earth minerals that are needed for that, and it's a good way to help balance the economic and humanitarian approaches. And then, of course, strengthening alliances. Kamala Harris has spent more time in Southeast Asia than any other president or vice presidential candidate, hopeful, or sitting in office individual that I have ever known. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not young, but I'm not in full knowledge of all history. So if I'm wrong, please correct me. Ding. And now, what she's looking at now on the economic engagement strategy. One of the things is that she actually has a cohesive approach for the region. While she does look at the individual countries and their needs, she talked about this at the ASEAN summit, but she also has a cohesive and strategic approach. She doesn't have a conception of a plan, she has an actual plan. And we like to see a plan in action. She's also using diplomatic relations as a way to balance trade. And that sounds really fancy. But what that really means is that instead of just saying, this is what we're going to do and trying to force it into action, she's negotiating behind closed doors in front of people. She's managing all of the diplomatic channels available to try to create a most balanced and strategic policy. And then, of course, there's the investment promotion. Many of you may or may not be aware that Trade Winds was here 2 years ago. Trade Winds is a program that takes U.S. companies and brings them to a specific country to help balance trade. It's like, we want to invest in you, you want to invest in us, and part of that has a program called Select USA, which has grown under the Biden administration, and Harris would continue to promote. Select USA says that we would like you to invest in the United States by expanding your businesses, giving more economic opportunity to those that are here in Thailand, as well as more economic opportunity in the United States. Anybody bored yet? No, so excited. Love hearing the girl from Alabama talk about the Democrats. Let's go, one more slide, ding. The multilateral approach. So she's been in the ASEAN engagement. She's got a regional understanding more so than other people we've seen. She can actually pick out all of the countries on a map, which is a real big step. She also understands the cultural nuances that exist between Laos, Cambodia, and the foreign direct investment coming from China, and the soft power that the United States needs to have in order to support that, as well as capacity development direct funding. And last but not least, while she is not what some would call an anti-Chinaist, as we do see in a lot of areas, she comes out as a balance. What we're looking for in a world as chaotic as we have now is someone who can bring stability and balance. And that's what she offers us. Ding! Now we're going to talk a little bit. This is all I'm going to do about the Trump campaign. I am going to do a little bit of compare and contrast about how we see the Harris-Walz camp versus the Trump-Vance camp. The whole purpose of this is to talk about how they would be seen potentially here in Thailand. So what we've seen is Harris's approach in general focuses on diplomatic relations and on conversations, and primarily around the economy, because ultimately that's where a lot of negotiations actually happen. However, from Trump, what we have seen in his previous administration and what we're seeing now is a rhetoric that's heavily focused on militarization. And there have been some very positive things that happened under the Trump administration with joint military operations and with conversations. However, we're seeing that become much more militaristic and a bit more antagonistic than we have in the past. Ding. So there's also economic strategy differences. So what we see is a comprehensive regional economic plan coming out of the Harris camp. And then under Trump, we see a bit more pressure on individual countries to try to create bilateral trade agreements, which the U.S. has not historically done many of and has typically been very difficult to get through Congress. So we see it as potentially being less effective. And as you'll note, there are references for all of these, which I'm happy to share with you later if you'd like. If you don't just like the dulcet sounds of my voice telling you information, you can check out the articles yourself. Ding. Okay, in diplomatic style contrast. So I think we all kind of see that Harris takes more of a multilateral approach, get as many people in the room as possible, talk to as many different voices, where again, Trump is more bilateral. And the real impact of this is we see the more people you have at the table, the better perspective you're likely to get. Whereas when you have a very bilateral approach, it's a bit more complicated because you're only getting two sides of the story, and there's no two-sided story, especially where trade and diplomacy is concerned. Ding. We're so close, guys. Okay, regional understanding. It is a really long PowerPoint. I'm sorry about that. I wanted you to have all of the information. So we have this nuanced approach of geopolitics. One of the things that was very interesting to me is the approach that Harris took in Thailand versus what she took in Taiwan versus what she took in India. You could see the subtle nuances in her understanding, not just of the economic differences, but of the subtle cultural differences and relationships that were required. There's also the need to navigate the relationships, and also the fact that she's flexible. We've seen her change strategy, or change tactics, but continue on with her strategy, as we saw in APEC in 2022. Ding. And then last but not, this really is the last slide. Everybody, you've done a great job. So we want to see the positive future for U.S.-Thailand relations, and as the chair of Democrats Abroad, I obviously believe that is a Kamala slow down. Yes, ma'am. Okay. So excited though. Our last slide will be delivered much slower. So, as the chair of Democrats Abroad, we absolutely believe the best opportunity is for a Kamala Walz administration to come next, because we believe we will see a continuation of the diplomatic and economic relationships that have already started, the ones that have been proven successful and have increased trade, increased jobs, and increased economic opportunity. We also believe that we'll see more shared goals. Instead of pushing a U.S.-only agenda, it will be a U.S. and us agenda, which will be more effective in Thailand. This is incredibly important, especially when we're talking about climate action, sustainability, and energy. These are the things that will require many people to agree, and we can't have a singular approach. And then, of course, increasing cultural ties. It is important for any administration to be able to relate to this region, and that has not been the case in the past. It's been nice to see that with Harris, and we look forward to the continuation of those strengthening ties. Thank you so much.
That was a lot of information in a short period of time. So, no, thank you very much for that, Jamie. Again, my name's Phil Robertson, and I'm actually presenting to you wearing the hat of my former employer, Human Rights Watch. I was Deputy Asia Director for about 15 years for Human Rights Watch, and it's not because I represent Human Rights Watch anymore, but actually because of the experience I had while working with Human Rights Watch, facing the changes of policy that happened, particularly between Obama and Trump, and then also between Trump and Biden. And I want to talk about 4 key areas about how very different these candidates are. And that's on the issue of human rights, the issues of refugees and migration, the issues of trade, and the issues of environment and global warming. Now, it's quite clear that the U.S. government is not necessarily the repository of virtue in all areas, especially when it comes to human rights. I mean, there are many places around the world where the United States is not doing the right thing on human rights. Gaza comes to mind. And there's a critique that the United States is involved in many cases in double standards on human rights. But be that as it may, the experience that I had over the number of years I was working on human rights issues was that of all the governments we deal with, the U.S. is the one that will most consistently raise human rights issues in Southeast Asia, East Asia, and South Asian regions. And that's very welcome, because actually there's surprisingly few governments around the world that do so, and do so publicly, especially when they know raising those kind of issues may antagonize a government, may create a problem in the bilateral relationship between the government, the host government, and the government that's criticizing them. So, if you're, for instance, a dissident in Vietnam, or a political activist in Cambodia, or an NGO worker unjustly charged with sedition in Malaysia, or a Uyghur refugee fleeing repression in China, or a Burmese democracy campaigner, or what have you, it's most likely that the U.S. will be one of the governments who will speak up about your case. And they're the sort of people that we can reach out to and prompt action. And what that reflects was a bipartisan consensus that human rights should play a role in U.S. foreign policy. And often the debate was how big of a role, how small of a role, and how did that role change depending on your relations with the particular government you're dealing with. But, it reflected that Washington policymakers, by and large, believed that some aspect of U.S. foreign policy also had to represent U.S. values, American values is what they would say. And that those values involve civil and political rights, freedom of speech, freedom to join an organization, freedom to peacefully assemble and protest, freedom of religion, freedom of the media freedom. That these things were somehow American, part of the American model, and therefore was something that U.S. foreign policy should also reflect in some ways, shape, or form. And in fact, that was a bipartisan consensus that held until Donald Trump was elected in 2016. But when Donald Trump became president, what we found was that bipartisan consensus was essentially shredded in favor of what became a more purely transactional foreign policy. The question that we were increasingly get was, why would we raise human rights if we can't get anything for it? What is in it for us to raise these issues of human rights? And let me give you a couple examples here. In Vietnam, in 2016, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was being negotiated by President Obama and his administration. Actually, Human Rights Watch at the time opposed that deal, but what it was causing was it created a great deal of leverage that if Vietnam wanted to be part of this trade deal, that it would have to make concessions on human rights. And it was doing so. It was releasing prisoners, it was engaging in reforms, including reforms of the labor law. It was allowing meetings with activists to take place. There was a creation of a bit of a political space in parts of Vietnam for people to do more. Fast forward to the election of Donald Trump. One of the first things Donald Trump did on the first day was basically withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He said that from his perspective, it was a bad trade deal that was going to sell out American workers, and he didn't want to have anything to do with it. And that was his perspective. But following on that, in early 2017, we had the Prime Minister of Vietnam, Nguyen Xuan Phuc, who visited Washington. And previously, Washington had been like the #1 human rights critic of Vietnam. When the Prime Minister went to the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and to the White House, our readout that we got afterwards was human rights issues were not raised in any of the meetings. None of the meetings. The only thing that was raised was, why was Vietnam not willing to accept green card felons from Vietnam back to Vietnam? And that was it. So you went from human rights as a big part of the foreign policy to being non-existent. And it was very interesting, as soon as the Prime Minister came back, we saw a crackdown. And that crackdown has continued to today. And in fact, the entire U.S. foreign policy on human rights towards Vietnam has really sort of slipped, even now under Biden. Vietnam has basically wiped out the civil society movement. It has the most political prisoners in ASEAN after Myanmar. There's no independent media. Freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion are all basically under threat. Right now we have the Vietnam government pressuring Thailand to send a refugee back, Win Kin Badap, Montagnard, back to Vietnam, even though he's a refugee. And so, you know, it was an entirely different thing. And if we look at what happened in Thailand, for instance, when there was a military coup in Thailand in 2014, President Obama called it a military coup. He cut off bilateral aid. They ended high-level visits, and they coordinated all those policies with the European Union and its member states and other allies. And the demand was that the new military government of Thailand should stop abusing rights, that they should schedule elections, and they should restore democracy. And as that proceeded, what you saw was a Thai military government that was constantly trying to break out of isolation and seek engagement to try to return to normal with the United States and the European Union. Fast forward to September 2017, where Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, General Prayut, finally gets the meeting that he has wanted all along. He's invited to the White House by Donald Trump. And there's a phone call that takes place in advance of that meeting between Trump and Prayut. And based on Thai government sources that were in the meeting, Trump, makes niceties for the first 5 or so minutes, and then basically tells Prayut that if you want this visit to go well, you should stop in Seattle on the way to Washington. And, the Thais were, why would we stop in Seattle? Well, Trump said you need to go visit Boeing and buy a couple planes. This was the conversation. If you want the visit to go well, go buy some planes. So the Thais stopped in Seattle and bought some planes for Thai Airways that they probably didn't need, and flew on to Washington. Now, the U.S. ambassador to Thailand at that time, Glyn Davies, was also along for the trip. As usually happens, the U.S. ambassador will accompany the visit of the foreign leader to Washington. And in the meeting at the White House, where the Thais were expecting the first question was going to be, when are you going to hold elections and restore democracy? That question just didn't come, and didn't come, and didn't come. Finally, what you had was Glyn Davies saving the day by passing a note down the line to President Trump in the last 5 minutes of the meeting to make sure that he actually raised the issue of elections. So, human rights literally just disappears from U.S. foreign policy under Donald Trump. Now, what we've seen after Trump left is, we have a Biden administration that's come in. Obviously, Vice President Harris is part of that administration, but it's not come back to the previous place. It's still, now, how is this government with us vis-a-vis China? And so Vietnam gets a free pass. Thailand raises issues like if you don't help us with this, we'll go talk with China. And all of a sudden, these issues on human rights get pushed aside. Similarly, North Korea and Kim Jong-un. The bromance between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, based on an uncritical engagement between the two. There was never any mention of human rights in any of the communiques that were done between the two governments, despite the fact that North Korea is arguably the worst human rights abusing country in the world. If you talk about LGBT rights, well, I think if Donald Trump returns, you're not going to see the U.S. ambassador hanging the rainbow flag in front of his residence anymore, anywhere in the world. So what we've seen is that a very, very different issue on human rights, but the human rights issue has actually, I think, been dragged further back. We're not fully recovered to the original bipartisan consensus. And that's a big problem. Now, another big issue is refugees, where the United States right now is the largest recipient of overseas third country refugee resettlement in the world. And not surprisingly, It has been the Democrats that have that opened those programs, and Donald Trump effectively proposed to end it in his policy now. During his time in office, when he came in, the United States was taking 120,000 refugees from all around the world. This is from places ranging from Ukraine to Syria to the Rohingya to Myanmar border, you name it, down to 30,000 the last year that he was in office. And it was moving towards zero if he had been reelected in 2020. Now, under Biden and Harris, the resettlement program rose to approximately 60,000 people. And we have, for instance, the United States making offers to take 10,000 Rohingya refugees from Malaysia, or resettle the refugees from the Thai-Myanmar border. Those are all processes that are ongoing. But that will all end if Donald Trump is elected, whereas if Harris is elected, it will probably continue. So again, refugee impact here in the what is happening in the region is something that the governments are very keenly interested in, because they recognize that the U.S. is a protector of last resort for refugees in many cases. Now, on trade issues, there's a very big difference, and Jamie covered some of this. But what has happened is that Donald Trump right now is proposing across-the-board tariffs on all exports to the United States. Now, some people are saying he's saying 10%, some are saying 20%. And what he's also talking about is creating what he's called an eye for an eye tariffs, so that if any government anywhere in the world raises a tariff on a U.S. good, there would be the immediate U.S. retaliation at the same level. And it's interesting because the Harris team has maintained a number of the tariffs that were brought in by Trump. So there is certainly an element still of some protectionism going on from the Democrats. But the difference is the Democrats are primarily talking about issues of, for instance, label environmental standards. That when they say we want competition, but we don't want competition based on exploitation of labor, forced labor, child labor, what have you. The labor issues are very sensitive in this region. Even in the absence of the main U.S. program, the General System of Preferences, which had worker rights conditionality and was connected to trade. We've not had authority for a GSP for quite some time. It's supposed to be sorted out between the two parties in Congress. Of course, it's not happened yet. But what I think is quite clear is that the Trump team is promising policies that will definitely affect bilateral trade relations in a very significant way. He's also said very clearly about the Indo-Pacific framework for prosperity, or the negotiations on that framework that Jamie was talking about, that Trump would scrap that day one because he thinks it's Trans-Pacific Partnership 2, even though it is not binding tariff agreements. So, again, you have a hostility towards free trade from Donald Trump that is quite clear, because it's America first, it's about preserving workers. And the approach from Harris is the other side around, which is we'll do trade, but we don't want trade that disadvantages our workers by allowing unfair competition from overseas. Finally, I think it's very important to understand that there's a very, very big difference between these two on environment and global warming, and that will certainly affect relations out here as well. Kamala Harris has said very clearly that she sees the climate crisis as an existential threat. Donald Trump has said that he sees it as a hoax and that he's not convinced by the science around climate change. So, you're talking about people at two opposite sides of the spectrum on one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with globally, in which I know certainly my daughter and all her friends, she's 23, care about this first and foremost. They're like, what sort of planet are you going to leave us? What we had is Trump, as soon as he got into office in 2017, he quit the Paris Agreement. Biden turns around and rejoined it on day one of his administration. And now Trump says that he will quit it again on day one if he is reelected. So, the Paris Agreement participants, I think, are going to be whiplashed by that. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was $370 billion for emission reductions, tax credits, and subsidies for clean energy, which Kamala Harris cast the tie-breaking vote for in the Senate, Trump says that he is going to get rid of that legislation. He's going to gut that legislation, and any unspent funds will be rescinded. Harris was an early sponsor of the Green New Deal, which was, of course, pushed by Bernie Sanders and AOC and Senator Markey and others, versus Donald Trump's continued exhortation to drill, baby, drill, and to open all public lands to gas and oil exploration. So what you have is two candidates who are promising the exact opposite on environment and global issues, global warming issues, which will have a direct impact for countries in Southeast Asia who are going to try to be figuring out how they're going to manage the requirements of trade and engagement with the European Union and others, and also with the United States. In fact, right now, the only thing that the two candidates appear to agree about is that both of them will continue fracking, because after all, that's a big issue in Pennsylvania. So what I would say is that you have two candidates who almost on every single issue that matters out here in Southeast Asia are going to be very, very different. And, you know, I have no idea to say which way we're going to go in this fork in the road. But the bottom line is hold on to your hats, because it's going to be quite different if Donald Trump wins, whereas I think more broadly, Kamala Harris will be a continuation of the administration along with some tweaks. So that's all I have to say. But I think we have plenty of time for questions, probably about a half an hour at least. So I want to encourage people to ask questions. There is a microphone right here at the back. If you want to ask a question, please introduce yourself. Hold on. Hold down now.
You've got great projection, though.
Oh, yeah.
I can hear you.
She means you're loud.
Okay. Technical problem solved.
For the recording.
You got it? Okay. Hi, my name's Lindsay Murdoch. I'm a journalist from Australia. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was quite very riveting, really. But I'm struggling to understand, you know, from a long way away, it's easy in a tabloid sense to say, well, people who vote for Trump, I just don't get it. I don't, you know, it's easy to say, oh, they're idiots or whatever. But I know that it's more complicated than that. It's more nuanced from that. So I'm very interested to hear from the panel about why people are voting, are going, you know, he's consolidated in the polls in the last few days. And he's a real chance to win this election. So I'm wondering if the panel could articulate about those people in those swing states. What are they thinking? Why are they sort of prepared to blow things up to vote for Trump? And if I could have a double barrel question, how much influence is Fox News in this election? Now they got pinged from the last election telling lies, but whenever I tune in, the bias is still there. They're not presenting the election on the basis of balance, fair, and accuracy as journalists, as journalists, we've always try to do. They've still got that bias there. How much will that impact the election? Thanks.
You start first.
Sure. Thank you, Lindsay, for that question. So, you know, why? Again, you could ask the question another way. It's just why isn't she leading by a landslide in this thing already? I mean, why are people still voting for Trump? And Lindsay, I think your two questions are actually relate to each other. Every once in a while, just for entertainment purposes and else time, I can't get Fox News here on my True TV Bangkok cable, but I can at least look at Fox online. And if you look at the right-wing media ecosystem, which is Fox News, Newsmax, One Nation, or whatever it's called. If you look at these, center-right news media outlets, which a lot of people watch, and Fox News is the most watched U.S. cable channel, you get an entirely different reality than if you look at CNN. And you get an entirely different reality than if you look at MSNBC, which is, center-left, way left. And what do I mean by that? If you watch CNN, for example, the lead story is often on, Ukraine, the what's happening in Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, the hurricane, etc. If you watch Fox, the lead story is often how many people crossed the border that day illegally, how many illegal apprehensions they've been. Crime is really up in New York City. Crime is really up in Detroit. How many? If an immigrant commits a crime and kills somebody in Pennsylvania or Arizona or something, that will be the lead story on Fox News, which most people watch. I mean, most people, because the cable audience is bifurcated, right? So most, that has it's not a majority, it's a plurality of people are watching Fox, and then everybody else is kind of split between CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're only in that conservative media ecosystem, you think the world in the U.S. is falling apart. And so so those two things are quite. Why are people supporting Trump? Because they see in that view, things are falling apart. What was the headline a couple of weeks ago about inflation? Most of the media, my newspaper, Washington Post, New York Times, et cetera, reported that it eased to 2.5%, 2.4%, or something like that, which is low. If you watch Fox, the banner headline is "Inflation Still Raging." It's still 2.5%. It's not inaccurate news as much as it's how you frame things, which stories you pick to highlight, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of people do believe that things are falling apart. Immigrants are coming off over the border in unchecked numbers. Every time there's a crime, it must have been committed by an immigrant. Crime is surging in the big cities. The big cities are out of control. Homelessness is out of control. It's American carnage, to use Trump's word. So if you're watching that, and if you're in that media ecosystem, that's kind of what you believe. You might argue that, but there's so many other ways to check this, and et cetera. But again, if you're on former Twitter, now known as X, if someone says, "Hold on a second, this isn't true," they'll say, "Oh, that's fake then. The fake news isn't really telling you the real story. The real story is over here." So there's no more agreement, and this is what I think is a big problem in the States. There's no more agreement on what's true. Look at it. I mentioned going back and I mentioned my old days going back and covering elections, but going back to 1980. Then there were only about 3 major networks plus PBS and a couple of others. Now, if you can go to the media silo that you want, that will tell you what you want to hear. And that's a huge problem here, because how do you fact check if somebody's in a world where, they can also get the stories that they want and get the stories that they want to hear. And then finally on that, it's kind of interesting, because all of the things that you and I and some of us might look at and say, but how can anybody go about, listen to Donald Trump, he lies all the time. The answer to some people who support him is, well, they all lie. How can you believe what he says? He said he was going to build a wall to Mexico and make Mexico pay for it, and he never did that. A lot of his supporters, and I talked to my Washington Post colleagues who go to his rallies, they say most of the people who go out of his rallies, they don't believe what he's saying. They know he's talking BS and all that, but they like the fact that he's stirring things up. He's sticking it to the own the libs, I think they call it. They like the fact that he's stirring things. They don't take what he's saying seriously. To them, it's kind of entertainment. And again, I'm trying to, maybe I can get some notes from you guys as I'm sitting here, because I'm trying to work on this piece about how populists, modern-day populists, maintain their hold on people. And again, whether you go back to Berlusconi in Italy, which I covered when I was based in Europe, or go back to Duterte in the Philippines, or some people say going back to Mr. Thaksin from 2000 here, or Bolsonaro in Brazil. These guys, they're more like entertainers, and they'll say all kinds of things, and the reporters are trying to fact check them and say, but that's not true, and X isn't true. But their supporters know it's not true. They know it's all a show, it's a game, it's entertainment. But one of the things they do is they talk in a way that ordinary people understand, number one. And number two, they say things that are impolite to say, that you're really not supposed to say, but everybody's kind of thinking. And that is what kind of makes them popular. They say, yeah, I always wanted to say that, but I wasn't sure I could actually say it. And Trump said it out loud. What do you think?
Well, I actually will take a completely different approach. I think this is there's 2 parts to this question that haven't been covered. I'm not going to go over why people believe Trump. I think the bigger problem is actually the repeal of in the rise of cable news. There was a repeal of a very specific law in the United States in the mid-'80s that required that all news be factually accurate. So when cable news came out, they wanted to create pundit shows. And so they lobbied very hard to have this repealed. And I say this as someone who comes from a family who owns media. So I'm very familiar with this particular law getting repealed because it made way for people like Tom Brokaw to be removed. It used to be that you had to go on the news, and if people could tell what side you were on, then you were no longer on the news. It had to be nonpartisan, and it had to be factual. Once the repeal of this law came and the rise of cable news, we got information echo chambers. You layer on top of that social media and the algorithmic disproportion of hearing your own voice said over and over again, it plays to the second part that I will bring up, which is a cognitive dissonance that we have between the world we can see with our eyes and the world that we have reported to us. It's also a behavioral scientist. One of the things that happens in human minds is the more we see something, the more we will let it override what our actual experiences are. You may see that there are no homeless people in your town. You may see that the crime rate is low, or you may see there is no wall in Mexico. But the more you're told this is a problem, the more you are told that this is the reality, your brain will naturally gravitate towards that because of the number of messages, creating a cognitive dissonance. People do not want to deal with cognitive dissonance. So if they already believe something and they have someone who says, this is what you should believe, this is true, they will go with that perspective. This is true almost always across the board, so maybe you can use that for your populist piece. If you already believe something and it is reaffirmed, you will continue to believe that in the light of the frequency of the information. So this is the rise of cable news as well as the rise of social media that contributes to this messaging overall, regardless of the side of the aisle that you are on. I would love to say that Democrats have some magical system where we don't have cognitive dissonance, but that's inaccurate. The difference that I'd like to point out right now is that we happen to have policies that promote being a human and being kind to each other. Thank you.
I would add that one of the famous lines from the 1990s was, "It's the economy, stupid." And the bottom line is that a lot of Americans are asking questions connected to what was it like 4 years ago. Were they paying more for groceries and gasoline? Were they paying more for rent or less? And on that judgment, they basically say, okay, I'm worse off than I was 4 years ago when the Republicans were in power. And the argument has been made, and I've watched this from several pundits, but I think it's also true that, if the Republicans had not nominated such a flawed candidate as Donald Trump, it's very possible that the Republicans would be leading this race by quite a bit. I mean, the fact that you have someone like Donald Trump who daily appears to be losing his marbles, I think and has all these high negatives and all these other issues, has kept this in some ways competitive because, many Americans are not invested heavily in either of the parties, and they're basically going to be, I'm going to vote and send a signal. And the signal is, I'm unhappy because I'm paying a lot more now for my daily necessities than I was 4 years ago. The fact that there was COVID, the fact that the entire global economy shut down, and the fact we had to restart all the supply chains, and you had to have stimulus, and you had to have all these policies and all these things, all that just sort of gets brushed away by people who are saying, am I doing better or worse than I was 4 years ago? And I think that's a big part of it. I mean, it really is that the economy is the big issue. Immigration, I think, is secondary, but it's secondary connected to people saying that, well, geez, these undocumented migrants are coming into our country and are going to take my job, or are going to undercut me somehow. And so it's a very selfish election. How are you doing compared to how you were doing 4 years ago?
Hi, my name is Michael Bach, and I think this is now my 6th or 7th election in Southeast Asia. Keith, you mentioned earlier, that the swing states are really where they're going to decide this election. Mm-hmm. And as a fellow Michigander, having voted in Michigan, and I've cast my ballot for Kamala for sure, I'm thinking about the very niche populations that can swing the vote, not only in Michigan, but other states. In the state of Michigan, there are, I think, 300,000 or so residents of Middle Eastern ancestry. And as they watch the genocide taking place in Gaza with American weapons, and an administration that has put no restraints on the government that's perpetrated that, and I've listened to reports on NPR and elsewhere that it really may swing their vote. They may not vote for Kamala because of this. And in the last election, I think it was only, 20,000 votes in Michigan that swung the state to Biden. So I'm wondering, as a fellow Michigander, someone who looks at the polls, what you might think. And then also, Phil, any of your thoughts on the human rights aspect to this, how it might play out in other states, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Good shout out for Michigan. Sorry about the Tigers, by the way. But, that's a great, look, it's a great question. But not only am I from Michigan and from Detroit, I'm actually from the west side of Detroit. I don't know, Schaefer Highway in Tyerman, which is the literal border street that separates Detroit from Dearborn. Dearborn, Michigan has the highest Arab population outside of the Middle East. And many of them are from Lebanon, many of the Iraq and Lebanon, Chaldean Christians, as you know, et cetera. And look, I was talking to somebody on WhatsApp the other day. I have a Lebanese friend in Hong Kong who's got a cousin living in Dearborn who said he voted for Biden in 2020 and he's going to vote for Jill Stein this time around. And I was saying, but why? Doesn't your cousin realize that a vote for Jill Stein is almost the same as a vote for Trump? He said he doesn't care. That he feels betrayed by Biden. And his grandmother's town in the south of Lebanon has just been bombed. And his grandmother is out in the mountains, but doesn't know if she'll have a home to go back to. And he says, and Biden's not doing anything to rein in the Israelis. So that's kind of the feeling that's going on there. He's going. I mean, if I had to predict anything, I would think that of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which are the so-called blue wall, Kamala could easily lose Michigan because of number one, that vote, which is not going to necessarily vote for Trump, which is actually going to be more pro-Israel, but they might just sit home or vote for Jill Stein or write in somebody as a protest vote. It very well could happen, and we don't know. Again, we don't know what's going to happen between now and November. You've got a few weeks left. I mean, is Israel going to bomb Iranian cities? Or we don't know. Is this bombing of Beirut going to go on, et cetera? We just don't know. So that's a huge problem. The other problem, so that's one problem in Michigan, and the other problem in Michigan is a buddy of mine who's in Detroit politics and Michigan politics was, again, telling me on the WhatsApp that you could get 25% of black men in Michigan are going to vote for Trump. And I said, you're joking, right? He said, no. I said, why? He said, you have to understand. He told me by WhatsApp. He said, number one, Trump is a bit of a rapper, All the things that we think are kind of silly, the bling bling and gold and all that, the kind of guys kind of like that. He has dinner with Kanye West. He pardoned the disgraced mayor of Detroit, Kwame Kilpatrick, and he got ASOP Rocky back from Sweden. You have to Google that, I know.
Yeah.
There was a rapper named ASAP Rocky who was detained in Sweden, and Trump actually got him back. And don't forget, Trump, despite the background, the Central Park Five, the birther thing and all that. I mean, he used to hang out with Mike Tyson, and he likes to hang out with Kanye West, and he's got this kind of weird bling bling rapper thing going on to him as well. And a lot of guys just say, oh, well, Trump is strong. She's a woman, she's weak, etc. And Obama tried to call people out recently where he said, black men, if you're not going for Kamala because you're worried about voting for a woman, that's not a sign of strength, that's a sign of weakness. So, I mean, you take away, again, she's going to get 75, 80% of the black vote, but if you've got 25% of black men, and don't forget, Michigan, of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan's got the highest black American population there, and if she loses that much of the black vote in a state that may only be decided by 80, 100,000 votes, that's a huge amount. And then you subtract the Arab American vote that might be a bit pissed off about what's going on, not only in Gaza, but also now in Lebanon, because more people there have connections to Lebanon than have to Gaza. That could spell, win or lose in Michigan.
Yeah. I was going to say that I think the Democrats made a major mistake in Chicago by denying a spot on the on the podium for someone to speak about Palestine. You know, I mean, the bottom line is they could have buried it like on one of the slots where nobody was really watching, or done whatever. But the thing is, they left the Palestinians sort of sitting outside the hall, and you know, you need to do something to actually appeal to that group, or at least give them enough of a reason to say, okay, we don't like Biden, but he's not running, but Kamala is, and you know, we'll give her a chance. But they haven't. They've given nothing to the Arab Americans in Michigan or elsewhere. There's literally been. I mean, sure, there's maybe been some outreach and things like that, but it's not been a lot. And so I mean, I hate to say it, but I think they've sort of written that group off. They're hoping that because Kamala is talking more robustly about the importance of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and that, you know, she's not going to stand by, that somehow this is a different sort of emotive approach that is going to convince some people that she would be somehow different. And I also see this is one of, so we've just had the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense write to their counterparts in Israel saying that if within 30 days there's not significant uptick in the amount of aid going into particularly northern Gaza, that the United States would have to consider conditioning some of their weapon shipments to Israel. But they've given them 30 days to respond, which takes it beyond the election. So, you know, I mean, it's sort of like, let's put something out there that makes it look like we're doing something when in fact there isn't really much happening. And I think that's careless. I think that is, not a smart strategy. If we look at it from a human rights perspective, I mean, it's quite clear that Israel's attacks are targeting civilians, both in Gaza and in Lebanon. These are against the laws of war, in international humanitarian law. They're clearly illegal attacks. And Israel is just ducking behind the United States and claiming that, you know, if the U.S. is on our side, we can do whatever we want. And that's not terribly helpful. But I also think that, you know, Bibi Netanyahu would rather deal with President Trump than President Harris. And so, I mean, I think there's probably some game playing going on from this very, very hard right conservative Israeli administration.
Jerry, you good? I'm a member both of the FCCT and Democrats Abroad Thailand. You've anticipated my question to a large extent. Mr. Richburg said he doesn't do predictions, but can we predict that the October surprise this year will be that Israel bombs Iran, expanding the Middle Eastern war, and you could have quite a large-scale exchange between Iran and Israel? The implication of that, to me, in spite of what both of you have said, probably would be to elect Donald Trump, because in spite of the 300,000 Arab population in Michigan, probably 99, if there's a real war between Israel and Iran, probably 99% of the American population is going to side with Israel, and they will see Donald Trump as being on Israel's side.
Oh, sure, I have thoughts. It's probably not helpful, but I've got them. So one of the things that I really see is that Biden and Kamala, by second stance, are really caught between a rock and a hard place. Right now, you can't come out and say, I'm pro-Israel because genocide. And you can't come out and say, I'm pro-Palestine because of the strong Israeli bloc vote. So it's a complicated question. What I actually wonder is, what we've seen in past elections is that a wartime president is always carried over. And as Biden is not running, the question to me actually is, would the American population see this as a wartime presidency vote, as opposed to who is deciding what about Israel and Palestine? And so if it is becoming a wartime presidency vote, then it would likely go to Kamala, in my opinion. I know that was good, right?
I don't want to add anything to that. That was so good. Yeah.
Well, I think that if you get into, a real shooting war between Iran and Israel, the net loser is going to be that, the argument is going to come from the Trump side that, see, look, the Democrats just preside over wars, and as soon as I get into office, I'll fix it. Which is bogus, because he's not going to be able to fix it. He's not going to be able to snap his fingers in the Middle East or in Ukraine. But, it fits with the narrative that, some people, I've dealt with some people even here in Thailand who have gone so far to the left, against anti-war, that they've ended up coming out on the right. And they basically say the Democrats are warmongers. And so there's going to be a certain amount of, again, it falls on whoever's in charge, which is Biden, is responsible for the chaos, even if, in fact, it's beyond his control. What I was hoping, and I think this is the one area where, the Harris campaign is perhaps misjudged, is that they should have actually done something more to basically position themselves, at least in Michigan, very clearly as prepared to try to do something different. Go there, make some promises, try to sort something out. Be able to say, like, look, we're this is what we're doing on ceasefire. This is where we're trying to get here. We all recognize that Bibi's the problem, and there's hope that what you say in Michigan stays in Michigan.
Thanks, Phil. Michael Batakiotis. Actually, I was going to pick up on that very point you were making, that people are so fed up with this administration because of the betrayal of shared values that they've moved to the right. And what they see in Trump, and I travel a lot in the global south, is they see someone who's anti-war. They see someone who's willing to make a deal, who doesn't feel that it's worth expending blood and guts on issues as far away as Israel. And that's exactly the point, that many people are fed up with the fact that a liberal democratic government has essentially betrayed almost every single one of the so-called vaunted shared values. At least that's the position that I read in the global south. And so there's the ironic position that a Trump administration that everyone saw in 2016 is talking to North Korea, trying to talk to the Chinese, maybe doing a deal with the Russians. These are popular positions in the global south. And so ironically, you may end up with an administration that pleases the global south more than the Democrats do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. People want things settled.
Yeah, and ironically, it used to be the opposite. If you go back to the Vietnam War days, it was Nixon who was considered the warmonger, and it was Hubert Humphrey and George McGovern who were considered the peaceniks. And if you go back to the 2000s, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney started the Iraq War, and Barack Obama was considered the guy who was the peacenik. He was going to get us out of Iraq and get us out of Afghanistan. It ended up being Biden got us out of Afghanistan. But the positions have switched now. If you look at Ukraine, it seems to be the Democrats with some centrist Republicans who are saying we need to keep arming, giving weapons to Ukraine, arming Ukraine. We can't let Russia win. And it seems to be Trump and the new isolationist Republicans who are saying, not our war. Let's get out. Let's cut a deal. Yeah. So it's really interesting how the two sides under Trump, have flipped.
Well, and one of the things that Kamala Harris said at one point was what isolation is not insulation, in the sense that you can't just bury your head in the sand and hope the problem goes away. But from Trump's perspective, I don't think he cares about Ukraine very much. So he's more than willing to might makes right. Putin's got it, and we'll deal with another problem if it comes up later. It's irresponsible kind of policy making, but it has a strong appeal. The appeal is, for the same people who are saying, I'm going to base my vote on the fact that I'm doing worse now than I was 4 years ago. Part of that is also that why are we sending all this money overseas? There's this crazy myopic idea in U.S. population, the U.S. Public opinion, that believes that something as much as 30% of U.S. government budget goes to like foreign aid. You know, they'll believe anything about foreign aid. And there's been studies been done by, you know, the University of Maryland and others that show these massive disconnects. You know, the fact that, you know, the United States doesn't even spend like, you know, 0.1% on aid, but, you know, the American people think that like they're giving everything away and like 30% of U.S. budget goes to foreign aid. It's nuts. But nothing people have said over the years has been able to blunt this sort of disinformation, which of course Trump and others promote, that, you know, we're giving everything away to foreigners and you, the American people, are getting screwed.
I'm a South African journalist. Looking at what you said about the impression many Americans have about the foreign aid budget, the U.S. spends, I think, pays for a very large portion of the UN budget. I think it's 25%, I may be wrong, and exerts influence on UN programs and decision-making in other ways. They have the right to appoint the heads of several agencies on ad hoc programs, for which they foot an even larger proportion of the bill. They may determine the remit. They've done that in the Congo. 50 years after the Turkish army invaded Cyprus, I think America still pays a third of the cost of maintaining a battalion of troops as a peace monitoring force. What effect would you see a Trump victory having on the work and on the budgets and the programs of UN agencies?
They'll be cut. We saw this before so I must put in a disclaimer that I have some insights into this partially because I'm a consultant for the United Nations, but this is not that hat. So under the Trump administration, the United States paid their dues later. They paid less than their full dues, and we also did not fund as many extra programs. One of the misconceptions that I would like to put a disclaimer about with regards to your comment of the United States has the right to appoint specific positions. No country actually has the right to appoint any specific positions. It is done via candidates being put through the system, and yes, there is some political pushing back and forth, but that's by every country on the planet, and the U.S. is an underrepresented staffing union within the United Nations overall by far.
What I would say about this is that the UN will definitely undergo a lot of rough sledding under a Trump administration. I would expect to see major cuts in what is provided, slow payment, provisions of riders and other sort of things attached to legislation, you know, demanding that the UN undertake such and such a policy or such and such a policy, which the UN will not agree to. You know, I think UN top leadership is afraid of that. I mean, they recognize, that the return of Trump would be their worst nightmare.
Can I add one sentence? Just one sentence. For example, I'm really interested in Haiti. And the U.S. now pays about 80 or 90% of the multinational security force that's now trying to police Haiti. Mostly led by Kenyans. We're paying their salaries. We're paying Canadians are putting in some, et cetera. I don't think that, and again, it has something that has to be approved every year. I don't see a future Trump administration continuing the support mission for Haiti.
Hi, I'm Peter, member of Democrats Abroad. Back to what you were saying about misinformation and also the echo chamber of the different media silos. You know, you look at people being interviewed on various, you know, shows, podcasts, or, you know, even comedy shows, where you see these people who are, you know, let's just say underinformed, you know, your low information voter, and they may be wonderful people, but they're they're stupid, you know. To what degree do you think that the drift in this direction can be laid at the feet of, you know, a poor education system in America, that people are just not as able to do critical thinking and not as able to discern fact from, you know, fantasy, as you know, some of the networks feed them. And I guess extrapolating from that, is this a global problem? I mean, we see in many countries, our own here, for example, where an undereducated population is not really making critical decisions based on issues, when they vote, or on who they support. But in terms of the U.S., do you think that the rise of Trump is to some degree a result of a dumbing down of the American population?
You please go ahead.
Well, just my 2 cents. Democrats are never going to win if they insult Trump's voters by saying they're stupid and they don't know anything and they should be voting for Harris, et cetera. They have to figure out a way to figure out what they're concerned about and why people are voting for Trump, as opposed to saying, oh, they're just stupid and they don't know anything. And I know you weren't saying that, but I'm just saying that if that there is, I hear that a lot. And you could call Trump whatever you want, but if you actually start attacking his voters, which is what Hillary Clinton did when she called them deplorables, et cetera, then you're never going to win because you're insulting people. But the group that interests me most are what they call the Obama to Trump voters. There are various precincts and various congressional districts that voted for Barack Obama twice and then switched to vote for Trump. And I think what the Democrats need to do is figure out why they did that. What was it that made them switch from voting twice for Barack? You can't say they're racist because they voted twice for a black president. They voted twice for Barack Obama and then somehow switched because Trump was speaking to them the same way that Obama spoke to them in 2008 and 2012. And again, these are people who felt disaffected. They felt globalization did not work for them. They felt that they lost, a lot of people got rich based on our new globalization and connections to China, but these people lost their jobs. And it's not good enough to go to them and say, well, just learn how to code. Just go do something else. And it's not good enough for them. And until Democrats learn how to speak to them, these Obama to Trump voters, they're not going to win. Democrat?
No, I mean, I was going to say, one of the intriguing things is to what extent has Kamala Harris's efforts to sort of, for instance, campaign with Liz Cheney or get these group letters from senior Republican national security officials and others who are endorsing her, to what extent will those efforts move disaffected independents or conservatives in any way, shape, or form? I mean, what I can't see is what is the sort of never Trumper vote out there actually worth? There's an argument that some of the pundits are saying that, in some of these red areas, and this goes to the point you were making, that there are a number of people who are prepared to vote for Harris, but they don't want to say that out loud. They're the sort of hidden Harris voters, particularly women. I don't know if these people are going to turn out. I don't know what's going to happen. But, I mean, I think that the problem is ultimately, there's a great deal of disaffection in the United States, which is, it's hard to understand, in basically one of the richest countries in the world. But I think it also reflects the fact that there has been such a total skewing of the gap between the poor and the rich, which, you have to lay at the feet of Donald Trump's policies. So he's sort of he put the policies to benefit his friends, and the rebound effect is that people who are feeling disaffected want to have change, and therefore want to vote against the Democrats. So,
all of this is assuming that people are actually making rational decisions.
Wait, I'm sorry, Peter. I'm going to stop you. He needs to go. He's trying to get up. Sorry. Just pause.
Yeah. We're gonna thank Keith, because Keith is flying off to France, and he was very generous to come and speak to us before him. But I'm happy to stay for a little bit longer.
These guys will stay. I have to run to the airport, but I'll see you. Good luck, everybody. Please vote.
Keith, thank
Everybody
you
vote.
very much for being here on the way.
Thank you very much, Keith. Thanks so much, man. Sorry, I let the time run on.
Don't forget your bag, sweetie.
Yes, indeed. My passport's in.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah.
So since I interrupted you, Peter, sorry. Please go on.
I was just going to say that your answers were all assuming people are making rational decisions. And, you look at your typical high school student in America today who can't name can't find a country on a map,
That's not new.
No, well, yeah, but it's gotten worse, and that I think might have something to do with the inability. What Keith was just saying about people responding to the way people talk or come across being the only thing that motivates how they vote, as opposed to actually thinking about an issue or thinking about is this better for me, is it worse for me? It's just based on the image and not really any kind of critical thinking. So my question was, do you think that this sort of lack of or dumbing down, really, of the American population is something that we can turn around or that will have an impact on this election and future elections?
Yeah, I don't
I'm
know.
sorry. No. I'm going to take a crack at it. You got your turn.
Okay.
You can come back again in a second. So I think you've made an erroneous assumption about the American population. So I'd like to see people in here raise their hand on who can pick out artificial intelligence information versus the average high schooler. You can't versus them. There's a different level of critical thinking. It's a different type of critical thinking that we're seeing now. It's not less logical. It's not less fact-based. It's different. And so there have been many studies that show people under the age of 40, and I say that as a 40-year-old, so it makes me a little sad. It's people younger than me, are significantly more able to pick out fake news than people over the age of 40. And so I think the critical thinking is not the issue. I think the problem is that they're actually thinking quite critically and quite logically, but we're seeing the young vote is going primarily Democratic. The problem is people over the age of 40. They're going primarily Republican. So to say that it's a change in the policy of the education system is problematic, because that would be a slow change that we would be seeing now. So we can't talk about the average high schooler now. We'd have to talk about the average high schooler 40 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really very suspicious about arguing some sort of broader trend of dumbing down or smartening up or whatever. I mean, I think that what you have is people who are, there's a certain, as Keith was saying, 46% of the Americans supported Trump in 2016 and in 2020. The big question is whether that's the ceiling for that guy or not. But I mean, people said to me, like, why do people go to like these Trump rallies? He does the same thing every time. And I'm like, it's like a Grateful Dead concert for the MAGA folks, they go gather with the tribes and buy their swag and hang out and yell at, I mean, this is fun. I mean, it's a carnival, and they get out there and and I think what we've seen with Biden stepping aside and Kamala stepping up is that you have seen on the other side also that festival effort and the sort of momentum coming. But I think it's really, I mean, the one thing that makes me optimistic that Trump will not get in again is that I think the Democrats have a better ground game. And I think that they've got a more effective ability to turn out the votes. I think that they've got the network. And what you've had is Trump has basically outsourced his ground game to a couple PACs and others, including Elon Musk's PAC and a couple others, who are not necessarily coordinating with each other. They're each sort of getting a piece of turf. Some of them don't have a lot of experience in doing this. And I think that, that ground game, in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Arizona and Georgia is going to matter a lot. So I think that, that's the one thing that I think is going to be the difference in this election is away from all the commercials and everything, it's like who grinds it out right at the end and who gets their people to the polls.
Yeah, I'm glad Peter brought up that subject, because I've also been struggling with why would anyone in their right mind vote for Trump? And I used to always say because people are stupid in America. But I have to take that back, because I have three sons. One's 22, the twins who are 19, and Jamie, I'd really appreciate you sharing your life history too. But all three of them are either anti-democratic party or pro-Trump. And the one who's the most pro-Trump, I just put on a plane today to go to Wyoming. because I said that'll be a safe vote to lose. And so he's going to work in the oil fields of Wyoming. But what I'm finding is I have many friends out here, family friends, who are highly educated and really clear cognitive thinkers. They're not dumb by any stretch of the imagination, but they are so pro-Trump, they're so anti-Democrat, you cannot get through to them. It's whataboutism, it's just the Democrats are evil, and there's no way that I can think of that we're going to change that mindset. Keith was suggesting somehow we have to talk to them. We don't. We have to beat them. And we have to make sure when we beat them that Trump goes to jail. And the Democrats can't be Mr. Softy, and they cannot just sit back and say, well, we don't want to do that to a former president. We should lock him up and keep him there till the end of his days. So sorry, I'm not asking a question here. I'm just giving my view. No,
I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole.
That was a political statement.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, what do you think?
I do think we should wrap it up, so.
I think we'll move on to the next question.
I'm Tim Cassingway. I have a question, but first I want to give a little pushback on the idea that the Democrats have become the hawkish party. Supporting Ukraine's ability to defend itself against an aggressor is not a hawkish party. Following Israel down this path is stupid, but it's not hawkish. It's just a decision, I think, that Biden made because of historical stuff. I mean, he makes a lot of decisions, off from his knowledge of history. And he says, this is what we've always done, this is what we're going to do. But anyway, so I don't think we're the hawkish group out there. But my question really, I wish Keith was still here since he's works for the Washington Post. But we see all these polls and so forth. I don't watch the news right now because I can't stomach it. But and they're all over the place and so forth. But my question is do you guys know of any metric or analysis of the energy following the two campaigns? Is there a high, and I'm not talking about his stupid rallies, but but the energy following the two campaigns? I follow finance quite a bit. CNN, for example, has a fear versus greed index. I don't know if you've seen it or not. And I'm just wondering if there's something that says, okay, this side has more energy than the other side. So.
I don't know.
I've not seen that. I mean, what I would say is I think that there's various indications of depth of support. I mean, the fact that Kamala has been able to raise so much money in a short period of time is an indication of that she has some, serious deep support in the party. And that wasn't necessarily a given, when Joe Biden decided to step aside and support her. I would say that the Harris campaign, with the exception of this Middle East question, has run a pretty flawless campaign. I mean, they've gone from strength to strength. They've been doing very, very well. They've been able to make mid-course adjustments when they needed to. The recent sort of discovery, for instance, that black men may not be supporting her at the level that they need to be supporting her so she can win, has now prompted, a flurry of policy papers, changes in her schedule, use of surrogates like Barack Obama and others, which shows that you have an intelligent, well-operating campaign that basically is able to figure stuff out and do things and change as they need. It's not like we're not dealing with like Michael Dukakis in the tank, or in the Willie Horton ads where don't respond. What you have is a smart and astute campaign, and so at this point, barring some sort of October surprise, which I can't necessarily fathom, except maybe an all-out war in the Middle East. But I don't think that's going to boil down. That's not going to really help either side very much. It's all about implementation now. It's all about identify your voters and get them to the polls.
So I'm going to go ahead and just call time on us. We've only got a few more minutes before 9.
Yeah.
And so
Do we have a couple more
we have
questions?
3
or-
more questions, but we need to be quick.
Okay, being quick. Number one, thank you all for coming. I wanted to have a question for Keith, but rewind to his initial comments about election night and how crazy close it is. So a quick promo. We will be having an election night / morning event at the Roadhouse. So everybody here that's interested, please do come.
You have to introduce yourself and say
Oh,
who you
excuse
represent.
me, Mark Yang, Democrats Abroad. So, sorry about that. So Democrats Abroad will be having another event for election night. So, to the question, given how crazy close it is, and I wanted to get Keith's perspective from a WAPO point of view and his colleagues, do you guys think there's going to be an issue with individual states having their results contested? And when are we going to know? Are we going back to hanging chads? What's election night / week / months going to look like?
I think what we're going to see. I remember in 2020, about like 12 o'clock or so, as I was drinking my first beer, feeling a bit sick to my stomach because it looked like Trump was going to win a number of the blue wall states, and that was later what we came to know as the red mirage. I had a couple more beers and I went home and went to bed, and when I woke up at 4 p.m., which was about an hour and a half later, things looked a lot better. It would have looked even better after that. But so I mean, I think that there's going to be the red mirage phenomenon is going to come up again. Although there are more Republicans now voting advanced voting than before, so I think that may mitigate it a bit. But there will definitely be that issue. Pennsylvania, because of a passage of a law, Pennsylvania is not allowed to start counting their absentee ballot votes until the day of the election, which means they're not going to be done by that night. It may take them a full 24 hours. So, Pennsylvania may be hanging out there for, a good 24 hours. We may be all the way through or almost completely through the 6th of November here in Bangkok before we know which way Pennsylvania went. And so, you can imagine the amount of angst that's going to cause. And I think that's going to be an issue. Georgia just basically dodged a bullet.
Yeah.
With the judge ruling that, the MAGA guys who took over the election boards changed that to say that any of these counties wouldn't have to be required to certify the vote. But there's all sorts of different challenges and things being laid out that will be the beginning of a guerrilla warfare, about the results one way or the other.
Yeah, I think just to be succinct, the answer is absolutely yes. The question is not if, but how much. Ta-da!
Hello, I'm Bev Frankel. I'm a long-term resident here in Bangkok and part of the FCCT for many years too. My question is simple. Trump has shown vengefulness if somebody opposes him. How much do you think that weighs in for some Republicans voting for him and not changing their mind? Is vengefulness like the Georgia election and Arizona election workers who were threatened and their homes were surveyed and so forth? He apparently is very vengeful.
I'll go first, if you don't mind. So I think that there's 2 pieces in my personal opinion to that. So yes, we have seen him be vengeful, and I, in talking to a friend just now, was given to know that he has in fact threatened individuals here recently at rallies. So I will say, knowing many Republican voters as I do, being from a red state, most of them don't believe that what he's saying is true. Similar to as we discussed earlier, they're like, oh, he doesn't really mean it. It's not really going to happen. And even the phone calls for the Georgia election officials last year, in the end, nothing happened to them. Of course. I'm not arguing against that at all, but nothing happened to them. They're still doing their job. They're still out living. So still there? Oh, I apologize. I thought you said Pelosi. I apologize. But my point is, from my understanding of the other side, it's that they haven't seen those threats be followed through with from Trump himself. Whether we believe that to be true or not in the future is not the perspective that I believe those people are taking, which is complicated.
Yeah. What I would say is that, I think what's happened to Liz Cheney is instructive to a lot of Republican officials. That, once she crossed him, he ended her politically. It's amazing that she and her father, who I don't like at all, are, following through. But, it's quite clear that they have a degree of principles that they want to see through to the end. I think that for your average local official, whether it be like a Secretary of State or something like that, they don't want to end up like Brad Raffensperger from Georgia 4 years ago, getting called out by Trump, basically being excoriated, facing death threats, all those sort of things. That's why I think it's very important for Harris to win and win cleanly in some ways, so that, the calculation from the Republican Party is not like, geez, we still have to fear this bully who's going to be attacking us and is going to be trying to extract revenge, but rather this is a two-time loser, and if we continue to follow him, we'll lose again, and now it's time to put him out to pasture. Last question.
Hi, I'm Michael March, FCCT member and one of the 3 former chairs of Democrats abroad in the room. Thought experiment. If we believe, and if Kamala Harris believes, that this is indeed an existential election, we hear that word a lot. It's a very, very heavy word. It means something. Do you think that President Biden should use the weapon that the Supreme Court, the gift perhaps, that the Supreme Court gave him in the immunity decision, to do whatever he possibly can from now past Election Day to future-proof the United States against Donald Trump in the event that he wins? For example, entering into 10-year contracts with every regulatory agency employee, giving them employment that can only be terminated for cause over the next 10 years. Just thought about this 5 minutes ago. Or whatever other list his brilliant advisors in the White House can give him that say, these are official acts that you can do as a result of what the Supreme Court has authorized. If it's really an existential, as this gentleman said, we can no longer, go high when they go low. We have to do whatever we can. What do you think about that as a prospect possibility? Because I haven't heard anybody talk about that.
Oh, you first, my friend. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah. Let me see, after drinking all the tequila at the FCCT, then, look, regardless of what I think about it, Joe Biden's not going to do that. Joe Biden's not going to do that. There has to be some degree of integrity connected to the Constitution and the process, even if the next guy is going to tear it down. I hate to say it. It's sort of like, if Harris loses clearly and fairly, then I expect that Biden will go along with it. I expect Biden might even show up at the inauguration, although I wouldn't. I don't know. I just don't see the level of And it would also depend also whether the House goes Democratic. I mean, are there still checks within the outcome that would allow, for instance, Trump's worst excesses to be stopped? I mean, I do also believe that, if he orders the National Guard to start rounding up leftists, that the National Guard's not going to go along. I mean, they might go along in some of the red states, but they're certainly not. The National Guard in Massachusetts is not going to do that.
They'll have the Border Patrol do it. They just endorsed Trump yesterday.
Well, I mean, but the thing is, I mean, what you have is as you know, a conglomeration of 50 different states. And what will happen is that increasingly, under that system, if the federal system fractures, then the states are going to go on their own.
So from my perspective, I agree that Biden's likely not to use it. I also fear the day anyone uses it. I don't want to see anyone, Democrat or Republican, use such an erroneous decision to their advantage. That is a loss of our democracy and our integrity. So I hope not. Although, to Harold's point, which you all couldn't hear, I would love to see some more Supreme Court justices. Just, however that could happen.
Right. So a very interesting, stimulating, thought-provoking, controversial discussion about American politics in which nothing was decided and everything was discussed.
What are you talking about? We solved the world's problems.
Stay tuned, folks. I mean, we're now 20 days out. It should be a hell of a ride. I think that, I talked to some other people who are trying to entice onto this panel, and they're like, oh, it doesn't matter, whatever happens, the U.S. will have the same relations with Thailand. I don't think that's the case. I think that's a bit naive. But I do think that what we will see either way is a visceral reaction, not only from Thailand and the countries in Southeast Asia, but also from governments around the world. Because everybody's freaking out about this election. And with that, good night.